So now that we've seen how we can add an event listener to our HTML elements in order to listen for when they get clicked, let's drill down and take a deeper look at how this add event listener function works, because it looks a little bit weird and different from the functions that we've seen so far. So over here, I've got the JavaScript Wikipedia page open, and I'm going to use it to show you a couple of things and what happens when we add an event listener. So one of the cool things that you can do in Chrome is you can highlight, say, the title here, and you can right-click, go into Inspect, which brings up the Chrome Developer Tools, and you see that the element that's currently selected, so the H1, can be accessed in the console using this $0 variable. So if we head into the console and we type $0 and hit enter, then you can see that this is bound to the H1 element up at the top here. And you can do some cool things with this and mess around with websites. Like if you say $0, which is the H1 element, dot inner HTML is equal to, instead of JavaScript, let's say it's equal to AngularScript. And now I've just edited Wikipedia's website on the fly, and this is a fun way that you can mess with friends. Now, of course, once you reload the website, then all of your changes are gone because it's loading up the HTML page from Wikipedia's servers. So all the changes that you're making is to your local copy of this Wikipedia page inside the browser. But if you catch your friend unawares and edit some of these pages, it's a pretty good prank. Now, at the moment, when I click on this H1, absolutely nothing happens because it's not a button and it's not bound to any event listeners, at least not yet. But that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to say $0, referring to the H1, dot add event listener, and the type of event that we want it to listen to are clicks. So that's the first input. The second one is going to be a function, and that function is simply going to console log the fact that I got clicked. All right, cool. So now if I hit enter, then that click event listener gets added to our H1. And if I click on this, I now get the console log that says it got clicked. And I can do that many, many times. Now, in this case, we've got an anonymous function as the second input. And we know that we can also specify it like this. So instead of using an anonymous function, we could use a named function, say something called respond to click. So the word click is the event that we're detecting, and that's the first input, or input 1. Now the second input is the function that should be called once the H1 detects the click event. So you can see that add event listener is taking two inputs. The first one specifying what event it should listen to, and the second one specifying what it should do once that event gets detected. Now, this is a little bit different from the functions that we've seen so far, because instead of just passing in strings or numbers or other simple data types, we're actually passing in a function as an input. Now, because we can't look at the code that Chrome uses to implement add event listener, because we didn't write that method. So let's try and create both sides of the coin, and in the process, we can better understand how add event listener works. So let's say that we wanted to create a calculator. So we could create a function that's called calculator, and it could take two inputs, the first number and the second number. And then we're going to do some calculations with it. So we'll say maybe return as the output, the first number plus the second number. So now if I call this function and I pass in some values, say 2 and 3, then I will get the output as 5, right? 2 plus 3. Now, if I wanted to change my calculator, so instead of adding my numbers, I want my calculator to be able to multiply, then I would have to change my calculator function and say, instead of adding, actually, I want my calculator to take these two numbers, first number, second number, and then it should return the first number multiplied by the second number. So now I can call my calculator and pass in the same inputs, 2 and 3, and I'll get back 6. because now our calculator function is multiplying the first number by the second number. Now, this is a little bit painful because, the kind of calculators that we're used to allow us to specify on the fly whether if we want to multiply or add or divide. We don't actually have to go and change the actual calculator each time. So what can we do instead? Well, what if we created a function that was called add, and it took two inputs, the first number and the second number. And this function basically just adds the numbers, right? So it returns the first number plus the second number. And then we go and create another function, and we call this one multiply. And this one again takes two inputs, and it returns the first number multiplied by the second number. So now that we've got two different types of functions, how can we create a function that's called calculator to be able to pick and choose whether if we're going to add or multiply? So this is a case where being able to pass in a function as an input to another function becomes really handy. So say we've created this function called calculator, and instead of simply just taking two numbers as the input, it's also going to take an input called the operator. And this input can be changed on the fly when we're calling this function. And when this function calculator gets called, we simply call the operator function, whatever it is that the user chose, passing in the two inputs, and return that value as the output. All right, so now let's go and hit enter and have all three of these functions available to us. And let me show you how we would call this. So instead of having to say add 2 and 3 or multiply 2 and 3, we can simply call our calculator function, and we can pass in our numbers, let's say 4 and 5. And the third input, as you can see here, is expecting a function because it's going to call it inside the body of this calculator. So let's say if we wanted to use our calculator to add 4 to 5, then we can simply specify the name of our add function that's created up here. And if we hit enter, you'll see that we get the result 9. Now, if we decided to use the multiply function instead, then what would happen is that we would call the calculator function. It would go and find where it was declared. 4 would get passed into the first input, num1, 5 becomes num2, and multiply becomes operator. So once it gets into the body of the function, it's going to output whichever function was passed in as the operator, so in this case, multiply, and it will pass into that function multiply the same two numbers that we passed into calculator. So now if I hit enter, you can see we get 20 because our calculator is using this function to calculate instead of this one. Now, before we mentioned that Chrome Developer Tools does a whole bunch of really awesome things. And one of those things is something called the debugger. So if you just type in the keyword debugger and then hold down shift and hit enter, then call the function that you want to debug, say calculator, 3 and 4, and multiply, and then we hit enter, then we enter the debug mode. So this is cool. And what you can do here is you can step through all of the steps that the browser goes through to give you that final answer. So we can see the process step by step. So this is usually used when you're trying to figure out what's going wrong in your code, because instead of playing computer in your head where you're imagining what should happen every step of the way, sometimes you're wrong, and it's really useful to see what's actually happening every single step of the way. So let's start. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to click on this button here with a down arrow, and this steps into the next function call. So once I click on it, we start off by calling the function calculator. So it goes and finds where that function was defined, which is here, of course, and it passes in those inputs that we gave before, which is 3, 4, and multiply. So now num1 equals 3, num2 equals 4, and the third input, operator, is equal to a function, as denoted by the little f sign, and the function is the multiply function, which is up here. So now the next step is that it enters into the body of the calculator function and it tries to call this function operator, which is currently the same as the multiply function. So now if we keep stepping through, it finds that multiply function and it subs in those two inputs where num1 is equal to 3 and num2 is equal to 4. And it returns the value of num1 multiplied by num2. So now if we continue stepping through, it takes that value that we got back and returns it as the output of the multiply function, and then returns it as the output of the calculator function. And finally, we get to the end of our code and we output the number 12. So this is a pretty neat trick whenever you're getting confused what's actually happening in each of the functions you write. And this way you can see stepwise everything that the browser is doing one function call at a time. These types of functions, which can take other functions as inputs, are called higher order functions. And this feature is available in a number of modern languages like JavaScript, Haskell, Swift, and a whole bunch of other ones. But it's not universal. It's not something that's available in all programming languages. But it's something that we'll rely on heavily in JavaScript as we learn to manipulate the DOM and give our website more and more behavior. So we'll come across this many, many times. Now, as a challenge, I want you to create a full set of operators for our calculator. So I want you to create the code that we've already made. So a calculator that takes two inputs and a function as an input, and complete these functions so that we have an add function, we have a multiply, we have a divide, and a subtract. So that when you call the calculator, you can say something like calculator 6 and 3 and subtract. And it will give you the right answer. So pause the video and complete that challenge. And once you're done, go ahead and try out the debugger and step through the function calls so that you're happy with how it works and how you can pass functions as inputs to other functions.